Welcome back yet again to the Law News Network. Aaron Keller along with you this afternoon, and it looks like they're taking another 5-minute break here. The jury has been sent home for the evening, but the attorneys are still hashing out some of the definitions and jury instructions. They've been doing this pretty much all the way through this trial this week, taking about an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, pushing an hour 45 minutes after the jury goes home in Nevada to argue about the jury instructions. But the big news of the day was the defendant himself giving an allocution, a little speech from the witness stand to the jury. Cathy Russon and I were starting to analyze that when they started this process. Cathy's back with me now. And Cathy, you think that he saved his own life?
I do. I think that was probably enough for this jury to vote life. Now, I would think life without parole. I don't know that they want to give this guy a chance to get out in 20 years. But I think that was enough. He sounded, now look, I'm skeptical at this point of a lot of defendants to get on the stand, but I'm thinking of the 12 jurors, and he sounded like he's really, come a long ways, I guess, in the 30 years since that, saying that he thinks about the victim every day. There's not a day that goes by. Now, I've heard, defendants say that kind of thing before, and when they say it, it doesn't sound that sincere. This guy sounded sincere to me. So I think that it's just enough. Defendants have a hard time juries have a hard time putting a defendant to death when they've heard from him like that, especially if he's not cocky or if he's, if he comes across like that. I was reminded on our chat room of a case that we watched a couple of years ago. It was the Jamie Hood trial out of Georgia. And he killed a police officer and attempted murder on another police officer and killed a fellow drug dealer. And he represented himself in a death penalty case. And he was the attorney. He was pro se. And we kind of chuckle about the case a little just because the guy was a little out there. And the case was really crazy because he was representing himself. However, he's a cop killer. And he saved his own life by representing himself. That jury did not put him to death, and I am completely 100% positive it's because he put himself in front of the jury, and they had to hear and see that human being. Instead of normally, we see a defendant sit at a table and never utter a word. So juries don't really get a sense of who they are or who they are now. I think that in this case, Valerio did just enough to save his life.
Well, it's certainly an interesting perspective. I at first wasn't sure because so much of what he said sounded like it read out of the inside of the flap jacket of the handbook for cliches that defendants say. But he didn't read it like it was a script. It sounded like it was his own voice.
No, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Now, you and I talked about this off camera, and and we may be a little more skeptical or be able to read a lot more into maybe a defendant's body language and stuff than just these 12 average citizens who, by the way, didn't sit through the entire guilt phase of the trial 30 years ago. They got a condensed version this time around. They didn't have to decide the guilt, but that's how they got the facts in, was kind of a condensed version, some of it reading transcripts from that long ago. And we didn't see like a mom up there crying because her daughter was murdered. We didn't see those kind of victim impact statements that we normally see at a sentencing. So we didn't see anything like that. And yet they got to hear from him, who really sounded sincere. That's why I believe they're not going to put him to death.
You raise another interesting question, and that is from procedural standpoint, why are we not seeing these other victim impact statements? Was no one available? Did no one give a statement at the original hearing? Who is able to speak on behalf of the victim? The victim was stabbed 45 times. And he basically sat there and said kind of sort of that he did it.
Right. And that was interesting too. He's not saying he didn't do it. Of course, he didn't sit up there and say he did it and how he did it and why he did it. We didn't get any of that out of him. But he said that he wasn't always a good person, and he did a lot of bad things in his life, and he's had decades now behind bars to reflect on his life and to want to do better and be better. I thought he sounded sincere when he talked about what prison life is like, and you have a choice. It's like you either you need to try and change things. I also like that he kind of made a comment about how I'm not here to say, I found God, something like, like every prisoner says that. And he sounded sincere about the way he said that like he's not saying he's changed his ways or changed his life because he found God in prison, even though he did say he prays a lot.
He said that he wasn't going to say it, but he kind of said it.
Right. But my point is, I think a lot of those jurors probably feel like the average citizen does, which is anytime anyone gets behind bars, they find Jesus, right? They find God. That's a very common theme, and they could be skeptical that that's really the case. But he made it sound like, I don't know, maybe I bought this thing hook, line, and sinker, but me, I'm usually very skeptical of what goes on in that stand, and I believed him. I felt like he was sincere.
I felt that the jury would probably take him sincerely, but I'm back into the numbers game end of this as well. Okay, there's 12 sitting in the chairs. It only takes one, presumably, to buy into it and then say no death penalty, because if the jury hangs, that's basically what happens. There is no death penalty. The judge can impose one of the other sentences, but there's no death penalty if the jury hangs.
Right, that's the whole thing. It has to be unanimous, and I think he did just enough that there's no way all 12 are going to vote to put him to death. And then it's just a matter of life without parole or life with the possibility of parole after a minimum of 20 years, which, by the way, he's already done. So that's an interesting concept right there.
I agree. I think it's one of the more interesting things that I've seen in a courtroom. I don't know if you agree, Cathy, but that's, I've heard a couple of defendants speak like this, but I haven't heard one quite that, I guess, articulate.
This is probably why I have the feeling I do about this one, because I have heard several defendants speak, either testify on the stand or give an allocution like he did with no questions and no cross-examination. I've heard it both ways, but I've heard it multiple times from defendants. And I have to say that really a majority of the time, a defendant gets on that stand and I start watching them testify, and it looks rehearsed. It looks very insincere. Acting is the first word that comes to my brain. I saw none of that here with him, and not even necessarily begging the jury. Nothing like that. I mean, he just kind of laid it out. Look, this is what I've been doing for the last couple decades.
Yeah, I just looked into one of the comments in the chat room, and this is a reaction to the discussion about them all finding religion behind bars, and then somebody jumps in and says, well, they seem to lose it as soon as they get out. Well, it's kind of a blanket statement. I don't know if it applies to everybody, but I guess maybe that's the perfect line for the prosecutor to use in closing arguments on Monday.
Now that's a good point. And I think we kind of all feel that way. I mean, yes, it would be great if, once somebody's convicted, they do see the error of their ways and at least try and be a better person, try and do better things. That would be the goal. I would think, especially if they're going to eventually get out someday. But I also think you're living there in a bubble and you're very isolated, that I think it's very easy to find religion or get a relationship with God or whatever happens. Yeah,
especially considering that that's something that prisoners have access to. They can't read everything. What do? They sit in the law library, go to religious services, that sort of thing. There's not an open-ended universe of things for them to do.
Right. So, I mean, it's not surprising that that's what happens. But just in particular, that statement by him kind of stuck out to me, that the way he said it to me seemed sincere. Like, I'm not just going to get up here and say, oh, I'm a changed person and I found God. Although, like you said, he sort of then also said that. But the way he did it, to your point, he's very articulate. And we don't always see that from a defendant on the stand either. So with this jury not having spent like weeks listening to this trial like they would have the first time around, and hearing every single last bit of evidence, and then eventually hearing from maybe the victim's family members, with them not having have that whole thing in front of them.
Yeah, Cathy, I'm going to wrap you up because I think they're back into session here. Let's cut back into the courtroom in Las Vegas. Cathy, good to see you again.